She hid to watch the mating ritual, until the Alpha King stopped everything when he caught her scent. Ever since she was born, fate had never been kind to her. After losing her parents during a rogue attack that destroyed her village, she was taken in by a distant relative who treated her more like a servant than family. While other girls dreamed of finding their mates and becoming respected members of their packs, she spent her days scrubbing floors, carrying water, and enduring whispers that she was cursed. They called her the wolfless girl because, even after coming of age, her wolf had never awakened. When news spread that the legendary Alpha King would hold his sacred mating ritual under the blood moon, the entire kingdom celebrated. Only nobles and high-ranking wolves were allowed to attend, while ordinary pack members could only hear stories about it afterward. Curious and longing to witness something beautiful for once in her difficult life, she slipped into the ceremony grounds and hid among the towering stone pillars, promising herself she would leave before anyone noticed. The ritual had almost reached its final moment. The Alpha King stood before the gathered crowd, ready to choose the woman who would become his Luna. Then suddenly, he froze. The air grew still. His wolf stirred violently beneath his skin as an unfamiliar scent drifted through the night air. Slowly, the Alpha King turned away from the waiting noble daughters and looked directly toward the shadows where she was hiding. "Come out," his deep voice echoed across the silent grounds. Her heart pounded. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her hiding place as she stepped forward trembling. The Alpha King's gaze never left hers. Impossible. Why was the most powerful wolf in the kingdom looking at her like that? And why did the nobles around him suddenly look terrified? As the Alpha King took his first step toward her, a furious voice suddenly rang out from the crowd. "Your Majesty, she cannot be the one." I hid to watch the Alpha King's mating ritual. He stopped everything when he found me. Ginevra had always known how to make herself invisible. It was not a gift. It was not something she was born with or something she was proud of. It was survival. Pure, ugly, necessary survival. When you grow up with no name that matters, no family to stand behind you, and no rank to shield you from the cruelty of people who have all three, you learn fast. You learn to press your back against the wall. You learn to breathe quietly. You learn to move through a room like smoke, there and gone before anyone thinks to look. She had been doing it her whole life. The fortress of Duchess Beatrice was not a home. It had never been one, not for Ginevra anyway. For the nobles who swept through its marble halls in silk and fur, maybe. For the Duchess herself, who ruled every corridor with cold eyes and a colder smile, certainly. But for Ginevra, it was a cage dressed up in stone and candlelight. She had scrubbed its floors on her hands and knees since she was small enough to fit under the kitchen tables. She had hauled water, gutted fish, stoked fires until her palms cracked and bled, and she had done all of it quietly, invisibly, because that was the only way to survive in a place like this. She was nobody. She had always been nobody, and for a long time she had made peace with that. Tonight, though, she had done something stupid. The door to the lower corridor had been left unlatched. Just barely, just a sliver of space where the iron latch had not caught properly, and through that sliver had come warmth and the heavy, sweet sting of wolfsbane smoke curling up from somewhere deep in the belly of the fortress. She had been carrying a bucket of ash from the kitchen hearth when she smelled it. She had stopped walking. She had stood there in the cold passageway with ash dust settling on her boots, and her heart doing something strange and quiet in her chest. She knew what tonight was. Every servant in the fortress knew. The moon ritual. The sacred ceremony held once every 7 years, when the Alpha King called forward the kingdom's highest bloodlines and chose from among them. Not just a wife. A Luna. A she-wolf powerful enough to carry the weight of his lineage and steady the wolf that lived inside him. It was ancient and it was serious, and it was absolutely, completely, under no circumstances, open to anyone without noble blood in their veins. Ginevra had no noble blood. She had no blood that mattered to anyone. She had ash on her hands and a bucket in her grip, and absolutely no business being anywhere near that ceremony. She went anyway. She could not explain it later, could not find the words for what pulled her feet down that corridor, and through that unlatched door and deeper into the warmth. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the particular kind of hunger that lives in a person who has spent their whole life on the outside of everything beautiful, pressing their nose to glass and never being let in. Maybe she just wanted to see it, just once, just to know what it looked like when the world decided to be extraordinary. The passage opened into a narrow shadow ledge above the ritual hall, more architectural accident than intentional design, a sliver of space behind a carved stone column where the torchlight below did not reach. She found it almost by instinct, pressing herself flat against the cold stone, and looked down. And the world below her took her breath away. The hall had been transformed. Every torch was lit, dozens of them running the length of the vaulted space in twin lines of fire, and the smoke from the wolfsbane censers moved through the air in slow silver ribbons that caught the light and scattered it. The floor had been cleared, and at its center was a circle marked in white chalk and crushed moonflower petals, their fragrance rising even up to where Ginevra crouched, sweet and strange and a little dizzying. Around the circle stood the noble candidates in gowns that cost more than Ginevra would earn in a lifetime, their posture perfect, their faces composed, every one of them a careful and deliberate performance of worthiness. Duchess Beatrice stood to the side near the council elders, and even from this distance, even in shadow, Ginevra could feel the precision of the woman's stillness. She was not watching the circle. She was watching the door. They were all watching the door. And then he walked in. Ginevra felt him before she fully saw him. That was the only way she could describe it afterward, in the honest, frightened corner of her own mind, where she kept the truths she did not say out loud. The air changed. It actually changed, the way a sky changes in the minutes before a storm, that electric, heavy shift that gets into your lungs and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Every nerve in her body snapped to attention without her willing it, and a sound rose in her chest, low and wordless, that she had to press her fist against her mouth to stop. Then she saw him. Alpha King Alessandro moved through the doorway like he had been poured into the space, unhurried and absolute. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she had imagined from the stories, dressed in deep black with silver at his collar and his cuffs, and his dark hair swept back from a face that was composed and unreadable and devastatingly certain of itself. He did not perform his entrance the way the nobles performed their worthiness. He simply arrived, and the room reorganized itself around him, the way water reorganizes itself around a stone dropped into its center. He walked to the edge of the chalk circle and stopped. The elders began the opening rites, words in the old language, low and resonant, filling the hall. The candidates lifted their chins. The censers breathed their silver smoke. Alessandro stood perfectly still through all of it, his eyes moving slowly around the circle with an expression that was not cold, exactly, but contained, like something enormous being held very carefully in check. Ginevra watched. She should not have been watching. She should have been back in the kitchen, invisible, nobody, exactly as she had always been. Instead, she was up here in the dark with wolfsbane smoke filling her lungs and her heart doing that strange, urgent thing it had been doing since the moment he walked in, and she pressed herself tighter against the column and told herself she would leave in just another moment. She did not leave. The rite moved into its second stage, the candidates stepping forward one by one, and it was during the third presentation that Alessandro went still in a different way. Not the controlled stillness of before. Something sharper, something that looked almost like confusion. His head turned. Not toward the candidates, not toward the council. He turned away from all of it slowly. His chin lifting in that particular way that Ginevra had seen hunting dogs do in the yard when they caught a scent on the wind, and his gaze moved up and away from the light and into the darkness above the columns. Directly toward her. Her heart stopped. She knew he could not see her. The shadow was too deep, the distance too great, the torchlight below too bright for his eyes to have adjusted. He could not see her. She told herself this very firmly, crouched behind her column with both hands flat against the stone and every muscle in her body locked into absolute stillness. He took a step toward the edge of the room. One of his advisors touched his arm. Alessandro did not look at him. He said something short and quiet that Ginevra could not hear from where she was, and the advisor's hand dropped away, and Alessandro took another step, and then another, moving away from the circle and the candidates, and the censors, and the watching eyes of every noble in the kingdom, moving toward the darkness at the edge of the hall where the torchlight gave out and the shadows began. Moving toward her. Ginevra could not breathe. She pressed harder against the stone as if she could melt into it, as if she could become part of the wall, as if every year of practice at being invisible would save her now. She was shaking. She could feel it in her hands, in her knees, that deep involuntary trembling that comes when the body understands something the mind is still refusing to accept. He was not supposed to be able to find her. She was no one. She smelled of ash and kitchen smoke and cold water. She had no wolf, no rank, no bloodline worth the ink it would take to record it. There was no reason, no possible reason, for the Alpha King to stop in the middle of the most sacred ceremony of his reign and turn his back on the most powerful women in the kingdom to walk into the dark. No reason at all. His hand closed around her wrist. It was not rough. That was the thing that undid her, the thing she would come back to later in the long, sleepless hours that followed. It was not rough. It was certain, warm, and devastatingly gentle, and when he pulled her out of the shadow and into the torchlight below, Ginevra stumbled and caught herself and stood there blinking in the sudden brightness with ash still on her hands and her hair falling loose from its tie and her kitchen dress absolutely wrong in every way for the room she was now standing in. The silence that fell was absolute. Every face in the hall turned to her. The candidates, the elders, the advisors, Duchess Beatrice, whose expression did something that was not quite surprise because she was too controlled for surprise, but whose stillness sharpened into something Ginevra felt on her skin like the flat of a cold blade. Alessandro stood beside her and did not let go of her wrist. Ginevra looked up at him because she did not know where else to look, and for one suspended, impossible moment, he looked back at her. His eyes were dark and searching and very close, and in them was something she had no name for, something that looked almost like recognition, like the expression of a person who has been looking for something for a very long time and has finally, in the most inconvenient and inexplicable of places, found it. She was trembling. She could not stop. Her whole body was shaking with cold and fear and something else she refused to examine, and her voice, when it finally came out, was barely a sound at all. "I was just leaving," she whispered. Alessandro did not move. His grip on her wrist did not loosen. And in the silence of that sacred hall, with every eye in the kingdom on her dirt-streaked face and borrowed dress, Ginevra understood with the slow, terrible clarity of someone watching a door swing, shut behind them, that invisible was the one thing she could no longer afford to be. Nobody moved. That was the thing Ginevra would remember most about those first few seconds. Not the silence, though the silence was enormous. Not the heat of the torchlight suddenly on her face after so long in the cold dark. What she would remember was that not a single person in that hall moved a muscle, as if the entire room had been painted mid-breath, frozen there by the sheer impossibility of what they were all looking at. A kitchen maid, standing in the sacred circle's light, the Alpha King's hand wrapped around her wrist like she was something precious he had just pulled back from the edge of a cliff. Then the whispers started. They came low and fast, moving through the gathered nobles the way fire moves through dry grass, and even though Ginevra could not make out individual words, she felt the shape of them on her skin. Disgust, confusion, outrage. She recognized the texture of that kind of whisper. She had heard versions of it her whole life, usually in the kitchen when she dropped something or moved too slowly or simply had the bad luck of being seen when someone powerful needed a target. It was the whisper that said, "You do not belong here." It was the whisper that said, "Who do you think you are?" She agreed with it completely. She absolutely did not belong here. That was not even a question. Alessandro's grip on her wrist did not loosen. One of his senior advisors, a broad man with a gray-streaked beard and the kind of face built specifically for disapproval, stepped forward from the edge of the circle. His voice was controlled but barely. "Your Majesty," a pause waited with every unsaid word imaginable. "The ritual." Alessandro turned to look at him, and something in that look made the advisor stop walking. Not a threat, exactly, just a certainty. The kind of certainty that does not raise its voice because it has never needed to. The ritual is paused, Alessandro said. His voice was quiet, and even the way deep water is quiet. There was no anger in it. There was also no negotiation. He turned back to Ginevra, and she made herself hold still under the weight of his gaze, even though every instinct she had was screaming at her to run. His eyes moved over her face with that same searching expression she had seen in the moment he found her, like he was reading something written in a language only he could see. "What is your name?" he asked. Her mouth was completely dry. "Ginevra," she managed. "I work in the kitchen. I am so sorry. I should not have been up there. I did not mean any disrespect. I was just—" "Ginevra." He said her name the way you say a word you have been trying to remember for a long time, quietly, like it settled something. She stopped talking. He released her wrist then, but he did not step away, and he turned to the nearest guard at the hall's edge and said something low that Ginevra did not catch. The guard nodded and moved immediately, and Alessandro finally turned to address the room with the kind of stillness that required no raised voice and no explanation and no apology. "The ritual is suspended for this evening." He let that sit in the air for exactly one breath. "Candidates are to be escorted to their chambers with all appropriate honor. The council will convene in the morning." The room erupted. Ginevra heard it even as the guard appeared at her elbow and steered her gently but very firmly toward a side door, the controlled chaos of nobles who had just watched the unthinkable happen and were not remotely finished having feelings about it. She caught one face in the crowd before the door closed behind her. Duchess Beatrice. Standing exactly where she had been, absolutely still, her silk-gloved hands folded at her waist and her eyes on Ginevra with an expression that was not angry. Not yet, but was doing careful and precise calculations about how angry it intended to become. Ginevra felt that look follow her through the closing door and down the corridor and all the way to the room she was taken to. A small but real chamber on the upper floor that had a bed with actual linens and a window and a fire already burning in the grate. And she stood in the middle of it in her kitchen dress and her ash-dusted boots and tried to understand what had just happened to her life. The guard had said she was not a prisoner. She did not feel like a prisoner, but she also very clearly could not leave, and when she tried the door handle an hour later just to confirm, it turned freely, which was somehow more frightening than if it had been locked. A locked door was something she understood. This open door that she instinctively knew she was not meant to walk through was something else entirely. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands together in her lap, to stop them shaking, and told herself to think clearly. She had broken into a forbidden ceremony. The Alpha King had stopped the ceremony because of her. She was now sitting in a room that was nicer than anywhere she had slept in her entire life, wearing a dress that smelled like wood smoke and kitchen grease. With no idea what morning was going to bring. The fire crackled. Outside the window, the moon was enormous and white. She must have slept at some point because she startled awake to the sound of the door, and there he was. Alessandro stood in the doorway in different clothes now, simpler, dark, no silver at his collar, and the composed certainty he had worn in the hall was still there, but something underneath it looked different. Tired, maybe, or strained in a way he was working very hard not to show. He looked at her sitting, bolt upright on the edge of the bed, and something in his expression shifted. "I did not mean to startle you," he said. "You did not," she lied immediately. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, and it was somehow more disarming than a full smile would have been. He stepped inside and did not sit, just stood near the door with his hands loose at his sides, and Ginevra noticed that his jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with the conversation. Like something was pulling at him from the inside, and he was holding it back through sheer will. "You have questions," he said. "About 50 of them," she said honestly, and then immediately regretted how that sounded and added, "Your Majesty." He waved that off like it was a fly. "Ask." She looked at him for a moment, then she chose the one that mattered most. "Why did you stop the ritual?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. He looked at the fire instead of her, and the muscle in his jaw moved once, tightening and releasing. "Because I could not continue it," he said finally. That is not an answer. He looked back at her then, and something in his eyes was very direct and very honest in a way that she had not expected from a king. No, he agreed. It is not. He left before she could ask anything else, and Ginevra sat alone in the firelight and pressed her fingertips to the place on her wrist where his hand had been, where the skin still felt faintly warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. She did not sleep again. Morning brought the sound of voices outside her door, and not friendly ones. She could not make out every word, but she caught the shape of the argument, sharp and urgent, and she recognized the tone of men who believe they are right and are furious that it is not enough. When a maid appeared with a tray of food and kept her eyes carefully on the floor the entire time, Ginevra asked quietly what was happening. "The council," the maid said to the floor. "They are not pleased, miss." That was, Ginevra thought, probably the gentlest way anyone would ever describe what was currently happening on the other side of that door. She ate anyway because she had not eaten since the previous afternoon, and her body did not care about court politics. The food was real food, warm bread and soft cheese, and something sweet she had no name for, and she ate it sitting on the window ledge watching the fortress courtyard below where stable hands moved through the early morning gray and life, continued its ordinary business, completely indifferent to the disaster she had caused. The door opened again mid-morning without a knock, and this time it was not Alessandro. Duchess Beatrice stepped into the room in pale blue silk, every hair placed, every gesture composed, and she carried a small clay cup in one gloved hand with the careful solicitousness of someone bringing comfort. She looked at Ginevra on the window ledge with an expression of practiced warmth that did not reach anywhere near her eyes. "You poor thing," the Duchess said softly. "What a frightening night you must have had." Ginevra said nothing. The Duchess moved further into the room, slow and unhurried, the way a very confident person moves through a space they consider theirs. "I have brought you something to settle your nerves, an old recipe. The girls in my household swear by it." She held out the cup. Steam rose from it, something herbal and sweet. Ginevra looked at the cup. She looked at the Duchess's composed, careful face. She looked at the gloved hands that held the cup with just a degree too much deliberateness, the particular steadiness of someone making sure they do not spill something they do not want to touch. "That is very kind," Ginevra said. "I am not thirsty." Something moved behind the Duchess's eyes, gone before it fully arrived. Her smile stayed exactly where it was. "Of course," she said pleasantly. She set the cup on the small table beside the bed with a gentleness that was almost ceremonial. "It will be here if you change your mind." She left without another word, and Ginevra stared at that cup for a long time after the door clicked shut behind her. She did not touch it. She did not move it. She just looked at it and listened to her own breathing and felt, in the space between her ribs, the very specific kind of fear that comes not from what you know, but from what you almost know, from the shape of something terrible that has not yet stepped fully into the light. Alessandro came again in the afternoon. He looked worse than he had that morning, and he was trying not to show it, and Ginevra could see both things simultaneously. His color was off, something gray at the edges of his complexion that she recognized from the kitchen when someone had eaten something that disagreed with them, except this looked older than that, more settled, like it had been there quietly for a while. He sat this time, in the chair near the fire, and for a moment he just sat there with his elbows on his knees and his head slightly bent, and Ginevra watched him from the window ledge and said nothing because she had spent enough years in rooms where the powerful people were not doing well to know that sometimes the most useful thing was silence. Then he reached out and picked up the clay cup from the table. "Did the Duchess bring this?" Ginevra's heart kicked hard against her ribs. "Yes." He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it back down with the precise care of someone who has just understood something, and when he looked at her, his eyes were very steady and very cold in a way that was completely different from anything she had seen in them before. "Do not drink anything that comes from her hands," he said quietly. "I did not," Ginevra said. Something moved across his face. It was not quite relief, but it was adjacent to it, and it was gone almost before it arrived, replaced again by that careful composure. He stood, and as he rose from the chair, he swayed, barely, just a fraction, and his hand came out and caught the back of the chair. Without thinking, Ginevra slid off the window ledge and crossed the room and put her hand on his arm. He went still. She went still. The tremor she could feel running through him under her fingers stopped. Not gradually. It stopped, like a sound cutting off, like a breath released, and the gray at the edges of his complexion seemed for just a moment to ease. His eyes came to her face and stayed there, and in them was that expression again, the one she had no name for, except this time it was sharper and quieter and more frightening than before. They stood like that for 3 full seconds. Neither of them spoke. Then Ginevra let go and took a step back, and Alessandro straightened, and neither of them said a word about what had just happened, because there were no words yet for a thing neither of them understood. He left. She returned to the window. Outside in the corridor, she heard his voice say something short and quiet to the guard. She pressed close to the door to listen and caught only 4 words, but they were enough. No one touches her. Ginevra pressed her back against the wall beside the door and slid down until she was sitting on the cold stone floor, and she pulled her knees to her chest and stared at the untouched clay cup on the table across the room and tried very hard to convince herself that none of this meant what it felt like it meant. She was not convincing. And across the fortress, in a corridor Ginevra had never walked and would not walk until it was too late to be surprised by anything it contained, Duchess Beatrice stood very still beside a figure whose face was turned away from the torchlight. Her silk gloves were still perfectly smooth. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a breath. "Tonight," she said. Just that one word. And the figure in the corridor nodded and walked away, and the Duchess turned back toward her chambers with the measured, unhurried steps of someone who has never once in her life been afraid of what morning would bring, because she was always the one who decided what it contained. She did not hear them coming. That was the thing that stayed with her afterward, through everything that followed, through all the noise and the storm and the fire of what that night became. She did not hear them coming. The servant who took her was someone she recognized, a quiet woman named Mara who had brought her meals twice and kept her eyes down and seemed, in the way of all people who survive in cruel households, to have learned that looking at things directly only made them worse. Mara knocked softly and said there was a message from the Alpha King, that he needed to see her, that she should come quickly and quietly so as not to disturb the council members still in session down the hall. Ginevra believed her because she wanted to. Because wanting to see Alessandro again was a feeling she had stopped pretending. She did not have somewhere around the 3rd hour of sitting alone in that room with the untouched clay cup and the moonlight and her own too loud thoughts. She believed Mara because the alternative was too complicated to sit with, and she was tired, and she went. The corridor Mara led her through was not the one that went toward the main hall. Ginevra noticed that. She noticed the way the torches thinned out and the stone got colder under her feet, and the sounds of the fortress fell away behind them like water draining from a basin, going quiet and then quieter and then gone. She noticed all of it. She just noticed it about 30 seconds too late. The door was heavy oak and old iron, and it shut behind her with a sound like a judgment, and the room on the other side was a cellar, low-ceilinged and cold, smelling of damp stone and old wood, and something chemical underneath, sharp and wrong, the same sharpness she had caught at the edges of that clay cup the Duchess had brought her. She spun around. Mara was already on the other side of the closed door. There was the scrape of a bolt sliding home. Ginevra stood in the dark and breathed. She was not a person who panicked easily. You could not be, not after the kind of life she had lived, not after years of learning to keep your face still when the Duchess walked through the kitchen looking for someone to blame. Panic was a luxury that required the belief that someone was coming to help you, and Ginevra had spent most of her life operating on the reasonable assumption that no one was. So she stood in the dark cellar and she breathed, in and out, slow and deliberate, and she pressed her hands flat against the door and felt the iron hinges and the grain of the wood, and she thought clearly about what was available to her. The answer was not much. There was a small grate near the ceiling on the far wall where gray light seeped in from somewhere outside, not enough to escape through, but enough to tell her it was still night. There was a wooden bench along one wall. There was nothing else. She sat on the bench and she wrapped her arms around herself against the cold and she waited, because waiting was the one skill she had that had never failed her. She did not wait long. Above her, through the stone and the distance, something changed. She felt it before she heard it, that same atmospheric shift she had felt when Alessandro walked into the ritual hall, that pressure drop in the air that happened when something enormous was moving with purpose through the world. Then she heard voices, distant but rising, and footsteps that were not trying to be quiet, and then a sound that made her breath snag in her chest, short and sharp and strange. It was Alessandro's voice, and in it was something she had not heard there before. Not anger, though anger was in it. Something rower than anger. Something that sounded like a person who has been holding something back for a very long time and has reached the exact end of their capacity to keep holding. Then the bolt scraped back. The door opened, and the torchlight from the corridor fell into the cellar, and Alessandro stood in the doorway, and behind him, crowding the corridor in a way that suggested they had not been given a choice about being there, were 4 members of the High Council in their formal robes, and 3 of Alessandro's personal guards, and a man she did not recognize whose bearing said he kept records of important things, and whose face said he very much wished he were somewhere else tonight. Alessandro looked at her on the bench in the cold, and something moved through his face that he did not try to hide. It moved through fast, but she saw it. She was good at reading the things people tried not to show, and what she saw in him in that moment was relief so intense it was almost painful to witness, followed immediately by a fury so cold, and controlled it was somehow worse than if he had been screaming. He crossed the cellar in 4 steps and crouched in front of her so they were level, which was not what she expected, and his voice when he spoke was very quiet and meant only for her. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. He looked at her for one long moment like he was checking that answer against the evidence available to him. Then he straightened, and he turned to face the council, and what happened in the next 10 minutes was the most extraordinary thing Ginevra had ever witnessed, and she had witnessed some extraordinary things in the past 2 days. Alessandro did not raise his voice once. He stood in the doorway of a cold cellar in the lower corridor of the fortress, and he dismantled Duchess Beatrice's position in the kingdom with the methodical, unhurried precision of someone who has been building toward this moment for a long time and is finally, at last, ready to finish it. His lead guard produced a ledger. The man who kept records opened it and began to read, and what he read was a list of purchases, dates and quantities and suppliers, and the council members' faces changed as they listened the way faces change when the thing they are hearing rearranges something fundamental about how they understand the world. The poison had been in the kitchen stores, in the specific stores reserved for the Alpha King's meals, for 11 months. Ginevra thought about the gray at the edges of Alessandro's complexion. She thought about the tremor in his hands that stopped when she touched him. She thought about the clay cup with the steam rising from it, sitting untouched on the table in her room, and she felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cellar. The Duchess was brought in by 2 guards before Alessandro finished speaking. She came with her composure intact, which Ginevra had to acknowledge took a particular kind of nerve, and she looked at the ledger and at the record keeper and at Alessandro with an expression that cycled through denial and calculation, and finally, when it ran out of other options, settled into something that was almost contempt. "You cannot prove intent," she said. "I can prove access, opportunity, and 11 months of documented purchases that have no other explanation," Alessandro said. "In front of the council, tonight, which is all the law requires." The composure cracked. Not fully, not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories where the villain breaks down and confesses everything. Just a hairline fracture across the surface of it, there and gone, but Ginevra saw it, and Alessandro saw it, and every man in that corridor saw it, and that was enough. Ginevra was not watching the Duchess anymore. She was watching Alessandro, and what she saw frightened her in a different way now, not because of threat, but because she could see what that 11 months had cost him, could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, and the color that was still wrong in his face, and the slight unsteadiness that he was managing through pure will. And she understood with sudden, awful clarity that whatever the poison had been doing to him, it was still in his system. And standing here in this cold corridor, doing the right and necessary thing, was costing him more than he was going to admit to anyone in this hallway. Then the full moon came through the grate. It came all at once, the way it does in the moments when clouds part suddenly, flooding the cellar with white light, and it hit Ginevra like a physical thing, like a hand pressed flat against her sternum, and every bone in her body lit up with something that had no name in any language she knew. She made a sound she had never made before, low and strange and not entirely human. Alessandro turned to look at her. The council turned to look at her. She was on her feet without knowing she had stood. Her hands were shaking, but not the way they had shaken in the ritual hall out of fear. This was different. This was deeper. This came from somewhere underneath fear, from somewhere underneath everything she knew about herself, from the part of her that had always felt slightly wrong in her own skin, slightly too much, slightly not enough, slightly like she was supposed to be something she had never been given permission to become. The pain came next. She had heard people describe shifting as painful, and she had always thought it was something said to frighten children, an exaggeration, a myth. It was not an exaggeration. It was not a myth. It moved through her like light through a prism, breaking her apart into her component pieces and reordering them, and she would have screamed except that the sound that came out of her mouth was not a scream. It was a howl, ancient and enormous and absolutely certain of itself. When it was over, she was on the stone floor of the cellar on 4 legs, and the world smelled like everything all at once. Rain and iron and wolfsbane and pine and Alessandro, most sharply Alessandro, and she lifted her head and looked at the doorway where he stood. The silence in that corridor was total. One of the council elders, an old man whose face had seen 100 years of this kingdom's history, took a single step forward and then stopped. His voice, when it came, was barely a sound. "Cursed blood," he said. "The old line, it is not gone." Nobody moved. Alessandro crossed the cellar and crouched in front of her exactly as he had crouched in front of her on the bench, at her level, his eyes on hers, and his voice was the same quiet thing it had been then, low and meant only for her. "I know this is frightening," he said. "I know you did not ask for this, but you are not cursed. Do you understand me? What you are is the thing this kingdom has been waiting to find for 100 years, and I need you to know that before anything else happens tonight." She held his gaze. She held it with everything she had, which was more than she had known she possessed, and she breathed in and out, and slowly, with the painstaking effort of someone learning a thing no one had ever thought to teach her, she came back to herself. She shifted back. It was not graceful. She was on her hands and knees on the cold stone in her ruined dress with her hair everywhere, and her whole body shaking with something that was not quite exhaustion and not quite relief, but was made of both. And Alessandro put his coat around her shoulders without a word, and she pulled it closed and pressed her face into the collar and breathed. And what she breathed in was warmth and pine, and that particular certainty that his presence carried with it, and something inside her. Something wound tight for 20 years of survival and silence and invisibility, came fractionally, terrifyingly loose. She did not cry. She was not ready for that. But she breathed. The storm came in off the mountains within the hour, the way storms come in this part of the world, fast and total, thunder rolling down from the peaks before the lightning even announced itself, and the rain hit the fortress roof like something that had been waiting a long time to fall. They moved into the open courtyard because there was no time for ceremony and no patience left in either of them for walls. And that was where the mating ritual happened, not in the sacred circle with its chalk and moonflower petals, not in front of rank nobility in silk and fur, but in the courtyard in the rain with thunder overhead and 2 guards and 1 wide-eyed elder as witness, and Ginevra standing barefoot on wet stone in a borrowed coat that was 4 sizes too large for her. The elder spoke the words. Alessandro repeated them. Ginevra, who did not know the words, listened to them instead, and when the elder paused and looked at her with an expression that asked if she was ready, she did not reach for ceremony or formality or any of the things she did not have. She just stepped into the circle and stayed. That was all. That was the whole of it. She stepped in and she stayed, which was the single bravest thing she had done in a life that had required considerable bravery. And Alessandro put his hand against her face, and the bond closed between them like a door swinging shut on everything that had come before, like the last piece of something enormous clicking into place. His wolf went quiet. She felt it happen. She felt it through the bond like a sound stopping, like a tension releasing, like something that had been straining against its own destruction finally finding solid ground. And the look on Alessandro's face in that moment was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on a human face. Not happiness, exactly. More than happiness. The look of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to not be in pain and has just been reminded. Dawn arrived slow and gray and rain-washed, coming up behind the mountains with the particular humility of a morning after a storm, as if even the sky was taking stock of what the night had done. The Duchess was in chains in the council hall. The elder who had whispered about cursed blood had spent the hours between midnight and dawn pulling texts from the library that Ginevra had never been allowed to enter, old texts, the kind with cracked spines and pages thin as skin. And what he found in them was a history that the kingdom had misfiled under the word cursed, when the accurate word had always been chosen. Ginevra stood in the courtyard as the light came up, still in Alessandro's coat, still barefoot, her feet cold on the wet stone. She could feel the bond like a new sense, a warmth at the edge of her awareness that was him, steady and present and certain. She could feel him behind her before she heard his footsteps. He stood beside her and looked at the sky with her and said nothing for a long time. "The council will want a formal ceremony," he said finally. "Of course they will," she said. "It will take weeks to plan." "That seems about right." He looked at her. She looked at the sky. The light was coming up pink and gold over the mountains, and it was, against all probability, genuinely beautiful. "You are not afraid," he said, and it was not entirely a question. She thought about that honestly, the way she had always tried to think about honest things, directly and without flinching. She thought about the kitchen and the cold, and 20 years of being nobody in a place that was very certain she was nothing. She thought about a cellar and a clay cup and Mara's eyes on the floor. She thought about bones reordering themselves in a wash of white moonlight. She thought about stepping into a circle in the rain and staying. "I have been afraid my whole life," she said. "I think I am just tired of letting it make my decisions." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very simply, he reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood together in the early morning light while the fortress woke up around them, and the kingdom began, slowly and with considerable adjustment, to understand that the thing it had been missing had not been missing at all. It had been in the kitchen. It had been hiding. It had been waiting, the way all necessary things wait, for the exact moment when the world was finally ready to see it.